Here we go with the first session in this unit on communication. We're going to talk about effective communication and its different forms and their applications. So we'll be talking about different types of communication and how it can be used in different situations. And as we've seen from that video, we can end up with miscommunication. So some confusions. Barriers that make our communications non-effective, and effective communication is vital in business or when you're running or managing a team. Otherwise we can end up with the wrong sort of candles, can't we? Let's have a look at the aims for this session. Quite a lot to get through, but they all link together nicely in communication. So aims are to understand different forms of communication and their application, understand how to manage challenging conversations, and know how to chair a meeting. So by the end of this session, you should be able to compare different forms of communication, including their strengths or weaknesses, explain when and why each form of communication can be effectively used, explain how to prepare for a difficult or challenging conversation, describe the techniques that can be used to manage that challenging conversation, and explain how to effectively deliver constructive feedback. And describe the circumstances under which situation should be escalated, so to your higher boss or whatever. So for meetings, we should be able to describe key documentation about that the chairperson should produce and circulate prior to the meeting, identify the steps the chairperson needs to undertake when preparing the meeting, explain how to effectively facilitate a meeting, and describe the steps that a chairperson needs to undertake to ensure that the agreed actions during the meeting are completed. A lot there, but don't worry about it. We'll break it down as we go through the different sections. So the way we communicate is one of the things that we're going to look at, and it's really important in the way we choose it. And ACAS did a survey that looked at the importance of communication in the workplace. As part of that analysis, they looked at the ways we communicate in the average working day. And interestingly, it came out looking at 4 main types. It said that 9% of the time we spend on written work, 16% of the time was spent reading stuff, but a massive percentage was spent on verbal communication. And I want to say verbal communication, I'm linking together there speaking and listening, because they are both parts of verbal communication. And I'm sure we've been involved in conversations where we feel that someone's doing speaking but nobody's listening, or we're doing speaking and nobody's listening. So those two go inextricably together, I suppose what I'm trying to say, and we'll look at that as we look at the different types of communication in the next slide. Communication, massively important, and nowadays we're faced with so many choices in the way we communicate. There's almost too many choices sometimes, and we have to choose what's the most effective for the workforce or for the situation, and how we're going to communicate can have a massive difference on whether it's going to be effective. We'll break them into categories before we start having a look at them. We can look at verbal, non-verbal, visual, written, and sort of digital, electronic, probably the latest sort of addition to our communication sort of choices. Take verbal first, and as we've seen in that ACAS research, that's taking up, because verbal includes listening and talking, so that takes up 75% of our workplace communication, and probably the one we're all most common with, and it includes things such as we got coming up there on the screen, such as face-to-face conversations, telephone conversations, lectures, presentations or briefings, and broadcasts. And the advantages of those are the links to the non-verbal communication, so the reading of body language, etc. And also the fact that we can ask questions, we can focus intention on people and show how important things are. The disadvantage is it takes time, resources, because we're all busy and people have a tendency to not meet with somebody face to face because time restraints. And we also need someone who can deliver it effectively. So, verbal communication is great, but it needs to be effectively delivered. If the person communicating it is not very good at verbal communication or doesn't listen, as we've seen, they take up a massive part, and that can have a heavy impact. So what are we talking about when we talk about non-verbal communication, though? We're talking about things such as vocal cues, so that's pitch, tone, speed, the volume, and also those noises that are not words. So when people grunt or they sigh, they're all non-verbal communication. And then, of course, there's also silences. As someone correctly said once, the very attempt of not speaking speaks a lot. People being silent can say a lot to us. There's, the body language and the gestures, we can go on about them all the time, but people use their hands all the time. The way people are making eye-to-eye contact, whether they're looking at us or looking away from us. Facial expressions, we read so much from the expression on someone's face as to whether they're understanding what we're talking about, whether they're taking notice of what we're saying. Then there's people's personal space. Is that face-to-face conversation close up? Are we sort of making contact, or is it across a desk, or is it at the other end of a room? People's personal space and the sort of area we take up around them. It can be massive in the way we read things, and it's a large percentage of what we communicate verbally. Next, we'll take a look at written, massive real sort of area. We've got emails, letters, memos, agenda and minutes for meetings, notices, newsletters, and more recently the internet and the intranet, which links into the digital and electronic, same as emails, but really is a written form of communication that somebody's got to read. So advantages, well, it gives you a good record of something. Once it's been written, it's happened, and there's a record of it. It's relatively quick and easy to do if we take into account the fact that we haven't got to go and see somebody, we haven't got that verbal sort of thing, we've got to go meet somebody, arrange something, get there, so we can just write it and send it, because the distribution is good, because not everybody has to be there when it's done. So that's quite often why written's chosen. Disadvantages is, does the communication get read? Written messages have to be clear, and there's very little chance to ask questions, so we need to have good skills in writing it. And then there's that, as I said, do they get read? There's that overload of emails is a prime example on the internet, where there's just so much information that some of it gets missed in the middle. It's not good for some styles. We looked at learning styles when we were looking at your self-awareness, and if you're a visual sort of person, then lots of reading isn't necessarily good, and we get no non-verbal communication in it, so sometimes it can be misunderstood. I mentioned there many of these link together, so we start looking at visual, and some of that's going to link in with some of the written, because we use pictures, maps, observing people doing things and we're watching them, and then there's links with presentations and briefings where we're using PowerPoint or visual stimulus, for example. And these link into the intranet as well, so visual links into many of those other areas. Advantages are, it gives an impact, it expands on things, and it gives different preferred styles something to see for those people who like to actually see something or observe something. But disadvantages, we need the resources. People can get a bit abstract with it and it distracts from it. People start getting, as someone called arty once, maybe we don't give the full info sometimes because we think a picture will do, and also it's got no non-verbal communication to back it up. Finally, we've got digital electronic, which is probably the newest sort of addition, as I said before, to our sort of choices in communication. Electronic includes things such as email, text, instant messaging, and then in digital we've got video conferencing, Skype, web broadcasts, all these sorts of areas, and then links to the internet and intranet. Advantages, particularly electronic, is with email, texting, it's quick, there's a record, availability of it now is everywhere, everybody's got devices. The disadvantages is at times people don't get access or they haven't got the resources, but also, as we said with email before, you can get swamped with it, and the instant access can lead to mistakes as well, because texting is a common when people just chuck things into a text or into a tweet and they feel that they've done it and then they notice there's a mistake in it, and also there is no non-verbal communication to confirm understanding. With the digital stuff, we've got advantages with video conferencing stuff now, because it replaces the time with face-to-face, doesn't take more time, there's a lot less traveling, it's now much more affordable and reliable than it was, and web broadcasts give us that chance again of saving time, but we also get that content where we can see the content, but we can also hear the person speaking, so it links in to the verbal. And the disadvantages, though, can be that some people may not engage with it. Plus, you need the resources and the time. There's no personal nature to it with the web broadcast, for example. And we just need to be careful that people aren't restricted to seeing it by the equipment they've got or accessing the resources to receive that communication. So we think we've sent it and they haven't received it. And there's an adage that I've lived by for a long time, which is judge your communication by the response that you get. So if you're not getting a response and people aren't doing, then perhaps the communication method wasn't right. So lots of choices and lots of forms of communication with some advantages and disadvantages. And these can be used in a formal and non-formal way. So let's have a look at that. Communication choices there. And at the end, we talked about the fact that some of them might be formal and some of them informal. So formal communications, what we mean is stuff that's passed through predefined channels of communication with the organisation. If there's a formalised method or a process for communicating, such as a letter about something from HR or an official memo from somebody or a notice that's put up about something, or you're called to a formal meeting about something, that's formal. Whereas informal is more communications that just flow in every direction and freely. So just a chat with your manager, or something you heard on the grapevine, or emails can be a bit of both. So if we have a look at this table just to compare them, you can see the meanings there as we've discussed, but then it talks about whether they're reliable. And formal communication, if the procedure is followed, is reliable and there is a record of what's happened, whereas informal is not really very reliable. It often relies on unwritten rules as well. People say, oh yeah, but I did that, but I didn't mean that, etc. And the grapevine, and there's no record. Formal communication can be slow because people need to do their parts of the process or procedures because somebody's not available on that day, so it has to be booked for another day. Whereas informally, that would just be passed on to someone else. Or could you let so-and-so know about so-and-so? So the time-consuming aspect comes into it. Formal can be time-consuming. Informal is not time-consuming, but it can end up filling people's time because people spend lots of time chatting about things and passing stuff on. So has advantages and disadvantages, as are there in the table. And then there's that sort of confidentiality as well, which we'll look at a bit later on when we're talking about those challenging conversations that we were talking about. If the formal process is maintained, then it's fully confidential and secret because it maintains the process that's been set about who needs to know what. And then the flow is quite restricted in predefined channels because only the people who are supposed to know, it's like a need to know basis, whereas informally things can move quickly and we can just get on with it. So that's the sort of informal and formal part of how we might use those communications. So we've established that we've got a mass of different types of possible communication. It's how we choose and what we decide to use that makes our communication effective. And there's a number of things we're going to need to consider in that sort of selection process, as we call it. We need to understand how different communication types differ, and we've talked about that in that initial slide about how they link together and how they differ. We need to consider the audience and what we are communicating. So what's the message we're trying to get across and who is receiving it? We need to consider barriers and potential barriers, and that may relate to the audience or the message. And then we need to take effect of how the organizational culture could affect it. So are we in a situation where people are in an organization where nobody reads anything and then we're sending out written communication? So that would be a barrier. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail in the future slides. Another thing we need to consider with communication, if we're talking about receiving a response, and remember I used and said an adage before about judge your communication by the response that you get, is when we want that response, and if it's something that requires an instantaneous response, if someone needs to carry out an action straight away so that we can move on with the next part of our job, because in some situations the response may be delayed. So we can do face-to-face, which is going to get us instant response, hopefully, or we could be sending an email and then awaiting response later on. And those two things really are termed as synchronous and asynchronous communication. Let's use an example, for example, that if I call you on the phone, I dial your number and wait for you to pick up the phone. You pick up the phone, you say hello, and in the very same moment I'm listening to you and I'm answering your questions if you ask me some. And when we've finished, after I've been sending you data, you've been responding and you've been sending data back to me, all in that moment, we've listened and received everything together. At the end, we say goodbye, that's end of transmission, communication finished. And one of us might say, okay, goodbye then, and we both hang up. So everything's been communicated and responded to at the same time. And that's synchronous communication. On the other hand, if I send you an email, I write it and I hit send and it sends its way off to you and I think, I've communicated, but you might not be at your desk, so I might have to wait for an answer. I might go and do other things in between, and then you return to your desk, you open the email and it seems like it's happening there and then for you, but I sent that ages ago. You write a response, you hit send, and then the same happens again, and I get a message saying I've got mail, but I might not be at my desk. So we're not communicating it all at the same time. I have to respond and wait, and sometimes that happens 2 or 3 times in that process for it to be communicated, and the communication hasn't happened until the waiting's over and the response has been received, and that's asynchronous communication. So when we're communicating, we need to make sure we're aware of what type of communication we're doing, otherwise we can become very frustrated in not receiving our responses. Thought about whether we're going to use informal or formal communication, and we thought about the method that might be best. We've looked at the advantages and disadvantages, and then we've thought about the response and whether it needs to be synchronous communication or asynchronous communication. Can we wait for an answer, or do we need to do something immediately? So we need to consider the audience and the potential barriers and the situations that we must consider. So on the screen now, a number of categories of barriers that we can talk about, and we'll just go through those. Let's start with physical. What we're talking about there is separation, location. If people are spread geographically, say they've got a number of offices across the country, do they all need to get the same message? Do they all need to get it at the same time? If so, then it's probably going to need to be written, and by that I'm talking intranet, newsletter, notice, or it may be verbal via a broadcast or a digital video if that's feasible. The working culture in the environment. What is the culture around communication in the organisation? What are the perceptions by the audience of the message giver? For example, if it's management, what do they think? Is the environment confrontational, for instance? Are there problems at the moment? Does formal communication have channels? So we talked about formal communication channels, but are they observed? Does the message get through? Or we may need to think about doing it informally. Status, what's the status of the audience and the sender? Is there a difference between them? Is there an issue? Could someone else deliver it? Is there someone who's better off in a position where it would be better received or more in tune with the audience? Does it need to be one-to-one? And if it's by a senior manager, that could be seen scary if the status is different, and people might not hold enough status on somebody who's junior. They may feel that they're an office junior and it's going to be disregarded if they're putting the message across, so we need to consider that carefully. Are there any cultural differences? That could be national or regional. Major national organisations have to be careful about operating in different countries and what messages might be received differently in different places. Causes confusion, can cause resentment. One-to-ones may be seen as only used for bad situations in some cultures. I've come across that myself, where making eye-to-eye contact with your manager is seen as challenging them, so body language can be an issue as well. Physiological state. Have people, and we're going to look at this when we talk about those difficult or challenging conversations, are there emotional or personal triggers? Are there past histories, recent incidents that could trigger things or cause barriers or conflict? So we need to make sure we're aware of that, and we'll look at that more, like I say, when we look at delivering those difficult conversations and managing them. What about the language barrier? And I'm not just talking about another language, I'm talking about jargon and terminology, making sure we're not presuming that people understand the things that are being put in the communication. Attitudinal, are there low levels of motivation or resistance in the culture? Can the meaning of communications be unclear? Will it be difficult to reinforce them? So we may have to do numerous, then we have to put notices up, we may have to try and speak face to face, we may have to go over the top in trying to communicate it and reinforcing it. And then systemic, lack of clarity in the comm system. Is there commonly confusion in the organisation in the way that information is normally passed on, how changes are dealt with? It causes issues. If that's not the normal way that things are communicated, will it cause a barrier that we're changing stuff and that it's going to be different? So lots of things to consider and many different ways to think about it in line with which is the best method to use. Then we'll take a break now from going through these slides and do an activity. We've considered a lot of things around methods, medias of communication and what we should be using, the advantages and disadvantages, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, whether it should be formal or informal. We've looked at other barriers. In this sheet, activity sheet, which you've got to download, there's a table. There are some instructions with it, but I want you to consider different communication medias and then give situations or examples of where they're used within your organization. Think about them in that situation and think about the strengths and weaknesses for that situation and the suitability of how that's communicated within your organization and any changes you would make. And it says that you must include at least one, but that's only at least, you can put more in, one written form, one visual form, one electronic digital form, and one verbal form. If there isn't one of those, and I would have thought the only one really would be electronic digital, where it might not be, think of an example where it could be used and how it could be a strength, a weakness, an advantage. So complete that activity sheet and then we'll come back after that.